So that question being said, knowing that the history, now everybody agrees that racism, that there is a history of racism in this country, but some folks would say, not so fast. We've made a lot of progress, right? And they cite Brown versus Board of Education. They cite the 1968 Civil Rights Act, so on and so forth. The question is, the systematic racism still exists in the country today, and in what forms?
Absolutely. Systemic racism is, there's no way that we could go through all of that jurisprudence and laws and all of that, like from the beginning of our nation, and even leading up to additional cases, recent cases. Arizona, the US v. Arizona, which was a case that the Papers, Please law with Judge Arpaio in Arizona, basically that you can be detained on suspicion of not being a citizen. That came out favorably for Judge Arpaio. He got sued later, and it was found that he did additional racist things. But basically, the ability to detain folks without you just had suspicion that they weren't a citizen. Well, citizenship itself is not criminal. Not being a citizen isn't actually a criminal act in itself. So you're detaining someone, and who are you detaining? What do they look like? Well, the vast majority of the people being detained were Latino people. And so, when you think about that was enshrined there by the Supreme Court. There are a ton of Supreme Court decisions when you think about that, when you think about stops and frisks that were allowed, when you think about no-knock warrants that were allowed, all of these things led into, we're not going to say it, but it kind of just applies to these people. Like they can, if cops want to stop you, it's because you're in that neighborhood. So if you're in your own neighborhood in a city where most people are people of color, they can stop you because they say that's a high crime area. If you're in a majority white neighborhood, and this is what they found in stop and frisk litigation in New York, if you're in a low crime, mostly white area, you get stopped because you don't look like the majority of the people there. So what was the commonality is no matter what, a certain group of people can always get stopped. That's systemic, that's there. And then you add to that kind of hiring practices. What is your training like? What does the training teach? Does it teach you are going in, you're fighting enemy combatants, or are you protecting your citizens? How does that training happen? What's the diversity? I know a lot of people that are in kind of, the space of like defund or defunding or abolition of police, kind of that kind of space. They don't like any discussions about like even diversifying police. They're like, well, they'll do the same thing. Studies have shown there are some marginal differences, right? But like what is being shown to officers, even Black officers, on, how you police communities. That's why when sometimes people say, well, it was a Black officer that shot the person, it's like, yeah, that's why we're talking about systemic racism. And we're talking about how systems, sometimes systemic racism could lead to victims that aren't people of color, because systemic racism is what keeps some of these things in place. It keeps a stop and frisk in place. It keeps a no-knock warrant in place. It keeps this ability for a cop to shoot someone, basically become judge, jury, and executioner, even if that person's white, and that cop keeps their job. There's no issue. That person, it's hard for the families to sue. All of these things. There's to protect the right to life for a family, to protect your right to due process. It's you lose in court all the time. There's the qualified immunity. There's all of these different doctrines that actually allow police officers to have a lower standard because they quote unquote have a more dangerous job. If they shoot you, that's more justified than if like two random citizens get into an argument and one shoots the other unreasonably. It's assumed almost reasonable if a cop kills someone when they're in an argument. It's when you think about it that way, it's like, wait, shouldn't they have more of the skills and shouldn't they have more training and skills to like actually not do that, right? More than a citizen. And if they're not doing it correctly, then we need to look at training, but we also need to punish those officers. So it's not just about policing, it's about systemic racism in terms of neighborhoods, same houses, same designers, same look, different part, different neighborhoods. Banks will say, well, this house with this, like, this is how much we'll give you for a loan on this part, 10 minutes from this other house. And maybe the other house is smaller and people can get more of a loan out on their house. What does that do? That builds wealth. People can go and do an add-on to their house. They can do updates. They can do their driveway over. They could take a vacation. They could do anything, buy a car, buy stock, whatever they want to do, and they get more value.
I don't know that I don't know if you saw it, but recently there was a news story that came out about it was a mixed race couple
appraisal. I saw that.
Yeah, there was an appraisal that was conducted on a mixed race couple's home, and the initial appraisal came out, and they weren't happy, they weren't satisfied, and so they went back, but they took all the pictures of any signs of blackness in the household. They took down all those pictures, and the appraisal literally, I think it went up like 120,000 or something like that.
Yeah,
something like this astronomical number. It shot up, and so basically the focus of the story was, wait a minute, why was it when there was evidence of blackness in the household, the appraisal came back substantially less than when there was no indication of blackness in the household?
Well, it infects, because systemic racism infects everyone. It also infects people of color on value and what we think, what we think our property's worth, what we think we deserve, what we think we are entitled to or not entitled to, how we think about these things, ownership over, institutions that are supposed to, we're their constituents, ownership over, politicians, we are their constituents. And everyone's treated it that way too. It's about the, systemic racism needs to be rooted out, root and branch. It's very difficult to get out. And it's not just in policing, it's like that housing, right? It's about communities like across the country that don't want low-income housing in their neighborhood, which has shown time and time again. One of the things,
not in my own backyard, that's what they call
it. Yeah, NIMBYs. But like one of the things that has been shown is, one of the places where that did happen was Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina has really diverse schools. The smallest achievement gap, because you had economically and racially diverse communities going to the same schools, and Charlotte is not like Charlotte Public School, it's Charlotte Mecklenburg, so like the whole area, and everyone's kind of intermixed. And that, one of the good things about that is, you get the racial and economic diversity, and it actually shows that it makes a difference in terms of student achievement. And I think that, when you think about kind of systemic racism, a lot of the things that can remedy it, it makes the social rights of the dominant group uncomfortable, right? And those who ascribe to those feelings and ideas of the dominant group, which can also be people of color, like, oh, I moved out of that neighborhood, like I don't want them coming.
Absolutely.
Like I
hear it all the time.
It would infects others, even Black folks, Latino folks. It will be like, no, like I don't want low income, housing here. And then also developers and politicians and everyone make exemptions for it. They're like, okay, well, we could do it, elderly people on SSI. So it's a lot easier to get an old person to like go into a low income housing than like a family, right? But no one can discriminate overtly, right? But you can, like, even looking for a house, neighborhoods. They did this one in New York and Long Island, where who do the realtors show houses to and in what neighborhoods? It preserves the nature. You had white people saying they were interested in majority Black and Latino neighborhoods, and they were being shooed away by the realtor. And you have Black and Latino people saying they were interested in white parts of the neighborhood, and they're like, no, I can't find anything there. So what are the realtors doing to keep that going? It infects everywhere. So it exists. Systemic racism, not only in criminal justice. They see Black and white people are use marijuana the same rate, and yet more Black people are in jail for marijuana offenses. You have, if you're more likely to be stopped, if you're more likely to be frisked, if you're more likely to be detained, if you're more likely to have police encounters, you're going to be more likely to face police brutality. You're going to be more likely to face an unlawful arrest, and you're going to be more likely to get a resisting arrest charge because you're indignant because you are trying to protect the rights you have, but yet the social rights of the state or of the municipality of, we're going to police you and we're going to find a reason to police you, it overcomes. And so then you're more likely to get prosecuted, have more charges, have a judge sentencing you more. All of these have been shown, and even with the same crime. So it's in criminal justice, but it's also in education. It's also in healthcare. One of the things that's been noted are, because of medical racism, some of the things with COVID, right? Like, you have, there's some parts of like healthy eating and how that works within our communities, that there's one part there, right? The other part is, you saw, especially in the beginning when there were spikes in cases, people were going to the hospital and being turned away. And every time I saw those stories, it was always a Black person being turned away, and then they ended up dying at home because they said, no, we don't have enough tests, maybe you don't have COVID. And then, so you think of it that way, that's just like that first threshold. But you can also think about it in the opioid epidemic. So doctors and healthcare professionals are actually less likely to prescribe pain medication. And if they do, it's a lot less to people of color. This idea of pain tolerance, or you're exaggerating. That's where you get like Black maternal mortality rates that are in the rates of third world countries. Also in places like Texas, Arizona, Latina mortality rates are like third world countries as well. And one of the reasons for that is this not listening to the symptoms, not being used to being receptive to, what someone's saying, disregarding what they're saying about their own body.
This idea that Black people have a higher threshold for pain than white people or anybody else.
And so when you have it with mortality rates for not just the infants, but also the moms, but then also when you think about it, just regular healthcare, getting prescribed pain medication, it had a different effect in this sense, this kind of really negative effect of that, this racism in itself. If we were more likely to get some pain medication and maybe white people a little less likely, you would have moved the pendulum where you would have this equilibrium. But this ability to kind of freely give it out has led to a situation where people had extra pills left over, then their kids take the pills, and then, or people, someone fell off the ladder at work, and then now that the drugs themselves were addicting, and there's all this litigation and stuff about that, but like, that it was addictive, opioids were addictive, and from there people got hooked, and the vast majority of the people that got hooked were white folks because maybe not just them, but maybe their grandmother, and they took the pill from them, their grandparents, parents, whoever. And because there were more of those pills circulating in that community for that reason.
What's interesting about when you talk about, it's well documented that, the way the opioid crisis, sort of the epidemic of heroin infiltrating suburban communities, the reason why we got here is from doctors prescribing pain medications, right? And folks got hooked on Oxy, and because their prescription ran out and they couldn't refill the prescription, they needed a way to nurse the addiction, right? And so that turned into a heroin addiction. I decided to do some studies because I was curious about what the penalties were for heroin possession. It's well documented that in the era of the crack epidemic, Black people or people in urban communities were being penalized harsher than folks who were in suburban communities, because you see crack usage in urban communities. That was an epidemic that hit the Black community or the urban communities very, very hard, and not necessarily cocaine. Powder cocaine, because it was a more expensive drug. And so in the 80s, the Congress decided to pass a law to get tough on drugs, right? And essentially, when the law passed, they basically created a 100-to-1 sort of a situation with the penalty for cocaine crack or crack cocaine. And what that basically meant was that for 5 grams of crack cocaine, you can get a minimum. So there was a minimum 5-year sentence. And 5 grams is literally like a couple of rocks, like 2 or 3, like maybe 4 rocks. And it would take 100 times more of the powdered cocaine to get a similar sentence. Mm-hmm. And so I actually researched, and I wanted to find out what, as I was saying earlier, what the penalty for heroin possession was. And so the minimum penalties today, heroin possession will get you about 2 years and $1,000 fine.
Today, and the thing is, for me, right? Yeah. I think of that, and I'm like, great. I think we should be talking about rehabilitation, right?
Absolutely.
I think this is awesome. I also lament that we weren't treated the same. The people in our communities were, kind of shuttled through. No one thought of, kind of rehabbing, making sure people are able to get clean, and making sure people are able to be safe and that your children are safe. And no one thought of it like a public health crisis. They thought of it as crime.
So now it's considered to be a public, the heroin, with the advent of the heroin addiction, now it's considered to be a public health crisis. Whereas when urban communities were dealing with it, it was the approach was getting tough on crime. And if you research the laws, I believe the laws haven't really changed when it comes to crack possession. It's still about 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I think under Obama, the discrepancy, the hole was closed. I don't think it made it 1-to-1, but I think it went down. I know that law came to be, but like that discrepancy was decreased. I don't think it was still 1-to-1.
So we're looking at different approaches depending on what group of people are dealing with the issue. And I agree with you. I think the way we're dealing with the drug epidemic today is actually the common sense approach. But that wasn't the thinking when these laws in the 80s were put into place. And so as a result, we have this mass incarceration where we have Black people and Latino people being incarcerated at disproportionately from their white counterparts. Today, 2.3 million people are locked up. There's of course a churn, but about 2.3 million people are locked up, and 40% of those who are locked up are Black and Latino. Are Black, even though they make up 13% of the population.
Yeah.
Right. A disproportionate amount. And we all, and studies have shown that the U.S. actually has the highest incarceration rate in the world.
Yeah, so I think locked up 60% are Black or Latino. 21% of prisoners are Latino, and 40% are Black.
Yeah,
and those two groups put together actually are only 25% of the U.S. population.
Of the U.S.,
together, if you combine. Yeah. So to have 60% of our prison population, and we have more prisoners than anywhere in the world on top of that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's I look at those statistics, and it's hard for me to rationalize this idea that systemic racism doesn't exist. But there are critics, right? There are critics who will say that systemic racism is not a thing anymore. We've made a lot of progress in this country. In general, we don't have as much attitudes of racism in the dominant white population, and in fact, it's not as overt as it was, say, 50, 60 years ago, right? And that those discrepancies, right? The Black Latinos being jailed disproportionately from their white counterparts, those discrepancies exist because of differences in value, because of the likelihood of these groups to break the law or to commit offenses, and that will draw the attention of the police. My question to you is, how do you respond to those claims? That it's not really racism, it's a reflection of values and
Well,
individual
first,
choice and behavior.
it's how do you build that pool? So one, when you think about, what's been criminalized, all right, you criminalize drugs, you criminalize the sale of drugs in a certain way, which then what tools is given to law enforcement to combat that? Okay, they can do no-knock warrants, they can do stop and frisk, they can do this, they can do that. There's not really anything else where no-knock warrants, stop and frisk, pulling you over for all of these different things, surveying you, is as allowed as it is with drugs, right? Like, there's not many other kind of federal crimes. Like, if you're a hacker, they're not like following you, tracing you. Like, they're going to look at your internet kind of activity. You're not going to be stopped and frisked on the street, right? That's not a crime that people are like, oh, let me stop and frisk you to see what you're doing. When people think about drugs, they think, oh, we need to stop and frisk this person because they might have it on them, right? They might have drugs on them. And so the more people, what we've criminalized, number one, and then how we give the enforcement tools for it. You can go into someone's house, you can do, the exceptions to the warrant requirement as to when you can go into someone's house as law enforcement, when you could do a no-knock warrant, when you can do a stop and frisk, when you can detain someone. The more people, so for example, right, you have, I'll do the New York stop and frisk policy. They allow you to deem anyone they deem suspicious that police can stop. 87% of those stopped and frisked were Black and Latino, when they only make up 50% of the city's population. White people subject to stop and frisk were more likely to have contraband, and 90% of those that were stopped had no charges put against them. So essentially, you are creating this second-class citizenship where people are just accustomed to being stopped, frisked, stopped, frisked. That has some effect on the psyche, right? You're a 14, 13-year-old boy, and you just kind of assume that that's fine, right? And this kind of invasion of your space, of your person, is fine by the state, right? Whereas you look at other places and they're like, no, that's not normal. The amount of times I've been pulled over by police is well over 10. I've gotten one ticket, and it was one of my first times when I was 16, and I was actually speeding that time. Every other time I've gotten nothing because I didn't do anything, right? So when you think of all of those encounters, much more encounters where you're being stopped, where you're being questioned, it creates a pool of people that you're looking at that is not reflective of the country at large, right? The other issue is, in the cities, everyone's very anonymous. There's a lot of people that live in the city, right? If you think of rural communities, a lot of rural communities are majority white. I also like to kind of couch that with, in the South and in the Southwest, a lot of rural communities are very Black and very Latino, just because I don't want people to always think rural means white, because that's not. But in a lot of rural communities, you don't have as much as that, because people actually know, the cops know that family. So sometimes you end up with corrupt police departments that like just hate that family, and they'll be like, I don't like this person, so I'm going to arrest the brother, the sister, everybody. But you don't end up with the race as almost a precursor, like for a police department or officers to kind of use race as like kind of a tag, like, all right, this is a prediction of criminality. There, they all know each other, and they'll use like, oh, he's from that family's crazy, so like, let me just catch up on them. And maybe the county prosecutor knows that family too, so maybe they don't charge them, maybe they don't charge them as much. When everything is so systemic and kind of like strict and like anonymous, and we don't know you, and you're not kind of a fabric of this community, it's very easy to criminalize someone. You dehumanize, you criminalize, and it's very easy to use the arms of the state to kind of warehouse them. Same way it's easier to take someone's children, like women of color, starting with, Black women getting their children's ripped from them, like during slavery, and Native American women getting their children taken from them too. These are common, these are historical things that happen in the US that the remnants have stayed, even though by law you can't specifically discriminate on that basis, it's still there. And so if we take into it and say, oh, you know, all these laws, Jim Crow existing, and the people that lived and developed Jim Crow, a lot of them are still alive. And you have lifelong judge appointments that are still like 90-year-old judges. You have, you know, people that are descendant from people that were imposing and enforcing Jim Crow, that are in government, that are in police forces, that are in, you know, every aspect of, you know, our society, and have an enormous amount of power. How do we think that that ideology does not seep in when we've seen time and time again, just the way the pendulum swings, that that ideology is, oh, it's an ideology that always comes back. It can always be stoked and it can always come back. And to put it on the citizen of color in the United States, that no one's being racist, you're just deficient, right? Like your community's deficient. That says something. That argument in itself says something. It says that laws and policy and everything are being written by a certain group with certain ideologies and the way it's being enforced. And I'm not saying people are going out there saying, I want to do X to people of color. I'm saying sometimes no one's in the room when that law is being written to say, hey, how about this? You know, this needs to be an exception. How about that?
And so, you know, like, I think I want to make sure that the viewers understand, like, I don't want to deny that, you know, there are what I would say some concerning statistics that exist in communities of color, right? And, you know, I don't want to deny that there are a lot of instances where the police need to be there, right? You see,
of course,
you know, you see that when you poll Black people, you actually tend to see that they are more concerned with security than their suburban counterparts, you know, for reasons of crime. So, you know, what we're not saying is that, you know, crime doesn't exist in urban communities.
Yeah, so that's always been a beef of mine with ideologically with some of my people that I feel aligned to in certain instances. But for me, having been and seen violence, street violence, real street violence, knowing what that is and what that looks like, I don't like it when people brush it off. There are generations of people that have been harmed and that are now doing harm. And I think we need to take where we could think that someone has mental illness if they go and they shoot up their school and shoot 5 or 6 kids because their parents got divorced. How do we think that someone doesn't have mental illness, some kind of PTSD, that they can go and spray up a house with bullets where someone's grandmother or a child lives and they don't care? That disregard, something is wrong. And we don't think of that as we think of that as like, oh, that's street violence. But why do we paint those things so different when I think they're based on mental illness? They're based on, you know, like some kind of, you know, PTSD. A lot of hurt people. And I think one thing that needs to be clear, when we talk about things like police brutality versus, you know, Black on Black crime, there's a few things. One, every crime, most crime against one another is usually intraracial. A lot of crime,
most crime in general is
interracial.
interracial.
Family, because we're so segregated, that's like crime is happening within communities all the time, right?
Yeah.
Like white people, Latino people, Black people. So that's one. So it's not like I don't like that framing because every crime is intraracial. I always think it's funny when people are always bring it up because I'm like, we're talking about the violence of the state and taking away someone's rights, constitutional rights. It doesn't even matter when people try to say, oh, this person committed a crime before though. You don't summarily execute someone for committing a crime. We have a system in place for citizens of the United States, and they
Yeah,
have
due
constitutional
process.
protections to due process under our system of jurisprudence here in the United States. And in that process of collecting evidence, in that process of giving them a trial, every piece of that needs to be free of racial bias. And it should be, it's not. You know, from jury selection to evidence collection, everything needs to be free of bias. And that is the way that you can get a really constitutionally sound system. But we're talking about preserving and protecting rights that will be good for all Americans if we make sure those amongst us that are the most disenfranchised are getting them. If we set that up as the ideal and that's what we're doing, we will be a much better off society, right? Like where we don't tolerate that, where we are saying like everyone needs due process. You need to do all you can to not summarily execute someone. You need to do all you can to make sure there's a fair trial. And you know what? If it's not fair, you got to throw it out. You might have to do a trial again. If the evidence was collected wrong, you got to throw it out. And so for me, it's about protecting constitutional rights. And that to me is about protecting the country and protecting our nation and protecting our ideals and protecting the Constitution of the United States. Not, and when that's not happening, that's a problem. And the reason it's not happening is because of race. But when we think about that, I think, yeah, we can talk about crime. And I think the police and the community need to do a better job of solving crimes. One of the stats I have here is, the murder of young Black and Latino men were the least likely to be cleared. Like the value doesn't just go with who the person is that's being subject to unbridled police discretion. It also goes towards, where the resources are going to actually figure out whether, like who killed who, like using the resources and building the relationships. And that's why I think, we need to think about crime in that way. Like we need to be figuring out like, how do we get in the community? How do we figure out like, how this person died and how do we make it better? How do we find the person responsible? How do we make the community responsible to that? First, it starts with making sure you protect the constitutional rights of the people within that community and say that and not make any other, that's the thing, when you throw out Black on Black crime or crime in this discussion, I think a lot of people hear that to say then being stopped and frisked or being subject to unbridled police discretion is just the way it's supposed to be. Yeah, if you allowed police to search every house without a warrant, they'll find everything and every crime for everything, but we don't allow that. Why? Because that's just like that is just too blunt an instrument to use, and people have constitutional protections. But when it comes to, our communities, that's happening all the time on the person and in our homes. And so I think it's about protecting us constitutionally. And I think there's other ways that we can figure out and solve crime, and especially violent crime. And I would never say violent crime is not an issue or what have you. I think the lack of clearance rates is an issue.
And I think that's the, I want to talk about that a little bit, or just kind of slow down and kind of focus a little bit more attention on, the clearance rates. Like it's known, if you look at the statistics that you mentioned earlier, crimes, in urban communities where, Black people are crimes against interracially, they actually tend to go unsolved, right? And so, policing is supposed to be used as a deterrent against crime, right? But when there's a crime committed, particularly like a homicide or some kind of violent crime, and it's not being solved, the folks who are responsible for the crime are not being brought to justice, and there's this whole argument about no snitch culture, which I have to throw out there. Like I wouldn't do it justice if I didn't. But really, we have to be looking at the resources that are being devoted, to address the crime. And
I think we need to promote a carve out to the no snitch culture when it comes to killing folks. Yeah. I just don't like, you're never going to get everybody around the way on board with like, no, but like someone's dead, like that
Yeah.
like someone died.
Somebody's
That's
died.
someone's mother, someone,
Yeah.
and you know, that person has family that, you know,
I agree.
you
Yep.
can't, you know, we can't be doing that. But I think that, you know, like I said, I think, you know, where people want to make it a culture argument, well, if here's an example, you said this earlier when you talked about Italians and immigrants that came in. One of the things that happened in a lot of communities when European immigrant communities came in, cities created a lot of these ordinances on noise, and where police can come and tell you to be quiet because for one reason or another, like Italians or Irish people were more likely to have like noisier homes and or music or more things going on, and so that was used to kind of police people, and you see that still kind of to this day, right? Where you think like just if you think about it, you have this ability where people are kind of enforcing their social norms on, you know, the out group, and so that group is in, right? And so I think if we took into account, like, if police didn't respond to, you know, calls about noise during the day, like I've had police respond to my house growing up because we had like a cookout and it was like 8 o'clock, right? And that could be people of color too that could be calling. I'm not saying, I lived in a very Black and Latino neighborhood, like, so I don't know if it's white people calling the police, but the idea of this noise during these, like, is it reasonable to call the police at 5 in the afternoon in the summer during a cookout because the music's too loud? Like, that should just be something that isn't done. Like, you do not police social norms like that, like a noise complaint, like things like that. When you think about it, you know, we just got to get better about like what, if a system isn't set up for you, if the laws and regulations aren't set up to take your community into account and the norms of your community and how it works, then it can be really used as a blunt object to enforce a social norm on you. You know, quiet the music, don't talk loud, you know, you need to be this way, don't hang out on your porch, you know, things like that, where other communities, you know, the law is made with them in mind and you don't have that issue. And so you get over policed and over criminalized.
That's good. That's good.
But poverty is also part of it. Poverty is always part of the conversation. The less money and economic resources people have, the more likely they are going to be in crime. But also we've done, you know, with all of these men, Black and Latino men that have gone through the criminal justice system that are under surveillance by the state after they've left, they can't get a job. Another example of systemic racism is they banned the box in some jurisdictions, and white men with criminal records are more likely to get a job than Black men with a college degree and no criminal record, right? Like when you ban the box. So it's always these little things that like it will always find a new way to reemerge because it is it's social norms, it's social rights, it's social, the way people see it. And so when you start to, those things seep into every decision, right? Like they're always going to seep in, and we always got to be really cognizant of it seeping in. And, you know, the less economic resources someone have, obviously anywhere in the world you find that, you know, you go to India, you go to France, you go anywhere, the less money someone has, the more likely they are to be doing crime. And then we also have this entire generation of people, children of people that have been incarcerated, or grandparents and parents that have been incarcerated, and siblings and brothers. And that has broken and fractured. And sometimes probably if they were they probably shouldn't have been incarcerated for mandatory minimum of 15, 20 years for a nonviolent crime, right? They shouldn't have been incarcerated for that long and taken from their community for that long. And then when they get out, they can't get a job. They can't move into housing if they're, you know, family, their mother lives there, they can't live with them. Kind of completely destroys.
Yeah, destroying. You're so disconnected from, you know,
from everything,
regular society.
and no rungs to kind of get yourself back up. And in a lot of places they lose the franchise of voting, where they can't even, you know, look to change that. So like when you think about it, you have this whole generation of folks that are dealing with that, and on top of poverty, and they're all interrelated. Like, of course you're going to have some more crime, but I think you got to kind of handle crime is a symptom of other things. And I think we need to handle a lot of the other things kind of in concert.
Yeah, man. I think going back to this idea of history, we need to look at history because it gives us context for why we deal with some of the issues we see today. You look at and I'll make this point, and I'll make this point, and then move on to the next question. You look at Jim Crow was basically the law of the land, right? It was enforced. There was laws enforcing it. It was the way of life, and then following the decision, I think it was Brown v. Board of Education, which struck down Jim Crow. All those years of segregation, it's not possible. Black people being excluded from home loans, business loans, jobs, education at every single level.
Establishments, just being
Establishment
from a place.
Yeah. Excluding from voting. All kinds of exclusion. There's no way that couldn't have a lasting effect, right? I think we're about 50 years from when the law was struck down. Jim Crow actually, you look at it, was in effect longer, than it wasn't in effect, right? So there's no way that that didn't have a lasting impact on society. And law, understanding these laws, looking at these cases individually, really give you a flavor for, why we live in the way we live in today, because these laws have so much impact on lasting impact, right? On economic patterns, political patterns, social patterns, like all of these things.
Wealth accumulation, wealth preservation.
Correct. And so it's really important that we go through these and we understand the history, so we can see why why we are where we are today. So the last question I have for you. A few years ago, you wrote an article about the history of race in this country, and you titled it "Acknowledge Racism, Acknowledge History, Give Us Value, Give Us Worth." And you detail the history of racism, injustice in our legal system. I've heard people say that the current unrest in this country has less to do with race and more to do with sort of this idea that there are liberal values infiltrating our democracy, right? And are infiltrating our democratic values and threatening to really destabilize, what we know as the American way. So the question I have for you is, given the racial unrest we see today, and a lot of conversation about injustice in this country, does race still matter in this conversation, or are we looking at something else really?
No, I mean, race, obviously, I think based on what we've already spoken about, it's clear that race does matter. I've actually, one of the things that when you think about it with Black Lives Matter, because they're Black folks are the most disproportionately affected by, unbridled police discretion. And when you think about it, if you make it better for Black folks, it gets better for everyone. If you make it so that that's not tolerated there, it's kind of like when you go to Latinos and immigration. If you make that better for them, because they're the most kind of denigrated in that space, especially right now, right? Like people don't think of an Irishman or people don't think of a Nigerian person when Donald Trump said rapists and murderers. They're thinking of a specific type of person, right? And when Donald Trump is yelling criminals and this and, they're gonna go into your suburbs and do the X, Y, and Z, the image in their head is someone Black, right? So when you think about it, if you make things better for Black folks when it comes to law enforcement encounters, it gets better for everyone. So I think, just to kind of reframe your question, I'm trying to think, what do you mean when you say liberal values infiltrating it? Because I think the values of like due process, justice are American values. So I think I know where you're going, but I just want to make sure.
Well, like that socialism that, a lot of these, and it's interesting, I've seen socialism sort of as a common cry for anytime there's some kind of social progress or some kind of progress in this country, I've seen folks cry socialism, right? I've even seen it when, you could look at the protests against integration in the schools. Folks protesting those, that
Social
Brownsview.
engineering.
Yeah. So they carry, you saw signs saying that, social integration or racial integration is socialism, right? So it was a label kind of just thrown to contest progress in this country, and you've seen it over the years,
With Martin
but
Luther
most
King,
specific.
communism. That.
Correct. So basically, what I'm saying is that there are these there are these values that we have as Americans. We talk about providing equal protections to everybody, right? Some folks would say, like I think one specific area, which is really like a emotionally charged area, is gun rights, right? Some folks would argue against, they would support the Second Amendment, but they would say, well, like, why do you need a high power rifle, right? Or if you're okay with high power rifles, or why is it that we don't have more checks and balances in place to make sure that somebody who's dealing with a severe case of mental health, right, is not getting a gun in their hand and being a threat to the general public, right? And so when you try to put laws in place that say, hey, why don't we figure out a way to keep guns out of the hands of people who are clearly going to be a threat because of their mental history? I've heard folks say, well, that's socialism.
Yeah. Well,
Or
because they say
that's
that.
liberal values infiltrating, our republic or
I've
our
actually
democracy.
seen a little bit of a change with the activist community on guns.
Mm-hmm.
This is anecdotal, but I feel like people under Donald Trump presidency have also seen like, oh wow, they've seen the way that in Kenosha, for example, the police and the 17-year-old white boy that went and killed two other white people he killed, was able to walk around with a long gun and police people in a community and in a state that he's not from and has no
Mm-hmm.
connection to. And they collaborated with him and they actually let him go home. They didn't even think he did anything when, the Jacob Blake went to his car and they shot him 7 times in the back, right? And that same police department did that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things with guns is, to be a person of color carrying a gun, like that can get you shot quick by the police. That will get the police called on you. Meanwhile, white boys, this is another piece of rights. White boys can walk around with an AR-15 in a lot of states and just be in a restaurant, and you just got to be fine with it, and you just got to deal with it, or let you walk in with that, right? And it's a problem and it's an issue. It's a safety issue. I think for a lot of people, there's a balance of rights here, right? But there's also an intimidation issue. These guys are going to Black Lives Matter protests against police brutality. And so much of, if you think about it, right, so much of what the Second Amendment is about is to kind of rise up against government that's tyrannical. That's the view, right? Yet they are working with the government that's suppressing certain people, these white militia guys, to further suppress them using their guns. They're using their guns to suppress fellow citizens rather than to have a check against a tyrannical government. I find that interesting, and I find it kind of, historical in a sense that, there's always been ways to put wedges between, people that may be of the same class. And I think, maybe there's white folks and Black folks that are of the same class, but having that ability to go and build a militia and go to the cops and say, hey, I'm going to help you police these Black folks marching for Black lives, and white folks that are marching for Black lives, who for all intents and purposes may be considered, maybe it's not said, but could be considered race traitors. You're going against the police to like protest them. Like, I'm going to come and I'm going to police you too, because he killed 2 white people, right? He killed 2 white guys. So I think just thinking about the right, that like first class citizen right to kind of carry a gun, and then how those cases will work out. I'm sure he may get off on it. The only reason he may not, if he killed 2 Black people, I'm not sure. If he killed 2 white people, I think that's probably more likely that he is going to get some kind of case and be convicted. But I think it is a really interesting thing to see kind of how rights work. That's a great example with gun. And like, you could be arrested for just having a gun. Like, be like, oh, you brandished the gun at me and now I'm arrested. Where, you know, look at the NRA didn't come to the defense of Philando Castile, who had a gun. They didn't come to the defense of Tamir Rice, who had a toy gun, or Andy Lopez in California that had a toy gun that he was walking home with and got summarily executed by law enforcement. Like, no, they didn't come to any defense. Like, they didn't think about, you know, Second Amendment rights for any of those people being infringed by the state. Even with the people with fake guns, that's still Second Amendment rights. These are still kids getting killed because they apparently have a gun, right? So when you think about it that way, it's like, all right, certain people can have guns, brandish them, walk around with them, be intimidated with them, and even get the benefit of the doubt in terms of self-defense and castle doctrine when it comes to, you know, having a gun and using it on someone, right? So that's one piece. I think the other piece is I've seen really diverse coalitions, and I've seen a lot more of my friends that maybe, you know, maybe not voted for Trump, but usually Republican. I think this idea of constitutionally protecting rights, like Black Lives Matter, is a movement, it's a moment. Yeah, there are people that are involved in the organization, like loosely throughout different states, the same way of any organization. It doesn't really have a top heavy, like we are, Black Lives Matter. But I think it's about protecting Black folks and showing that Black people do matter in economic.
You know, I'm glad you said that. I mean, we won't go too deep into that. I mean, if I can, I'd like to actually devote an episode on, you know, what do people say when they say Black Lives Matter, right? Because I know people who tend to be, you know, critics of the organization, you know, sort of lump the statement Black Lives Matter with the organization and some of the values of the organization, right?
I think the fact that they have been able, these young activists have been able to kind of break through the consciousness of corporate America, which I think was important because that's where a lot of happens, break through the consciousness of politically a little bit, break through the consciousness of a lot of white folks where you get 50-50 now, where before it was like 35% of white folks, now it's like 50%, and a lot of these protests are majority white. It's kind of a beautiful thing to see, and I think what the right wing right now is probably trying to do is make it into like, these are socialist Marxists, like if you have a Black Lives Matter sign, you're a socialist Marxist. But I think people are smarter than that, and I think that I hope people are smarter than that, and I hope that it continues, because I think just even saying those words, and I think for Black kids walking in the street where they'll, especially in majority white communities, and see signs that say Black Lives Matter, I think one thing it does is say that's a safe space. That's someone who, you know, if I'm like in trouble and something's happening, maybe that is someone, you know, maybe not, right? But I think it's important to kind of have that. There's been so much that has dragged, you know, Black kids, Latino kids down from everything they've seen, to see something that empowering around them and people yelling that aloud and starting to think about it, really moving the needle. I think that's powerful. And I think that, you know, kind of to your question, because I think this was part of it, you know, when I look at Portland and I look at even Kenosha, and I think of, you know, I don't personally, for me, like, I associate those militias. That kid was a Donald Trump supporter. He was sitting in front row at a Donald Trump rally, right? Donald Trump has embraced that. He hasn't even said that kid did anything wrong, which is it's a big red flag for me, because it makes me feel like the election, whether he win or lose, it's going to be very violent and dangerous, because we have someone at the helm that doesn't care. So that's number one. But like, when you look at the left wing, they're not waving the right wing militias with these white guys, boogaloos, whatever, and white supremacists, white nationalists. They're waving Trump flags. They're under that flag. Whereas on the other side, Antifa, these white boys that with ponytails, majority white and majority male, Antifa is left wing, anti-fascist. They don't vote. They're not voting. Antifa was around. They were going against Obama, and they're not going to vote for Joe Biden. He doesn't represent them. They're kind of like an off the grid group, right? And I don't like that they have used the protest to have this little pseudo civil war with the white nationalists and the white militias, and you have these white boys kind of on both sides using these protests and movement for Black lives to do kind of, civil war drills. It feels like second civil war drills. That's what it feels like when you look at, you can go and look at like who has started a lot of the fires. It's been white supremacists, it's been Antifa types, or even just overzealous white people. Like seeing racism right there in their face can cause a lot of emotions, especially if you're coming of age. Whereas I think for us, right, kind of used to seeing it. So when you see white people so upset about it, it's like we've been upset for so long that, when we see it and we're accustomed to it, a lot of times they don't know how to deal as much. Like in Minnesota, one of the stores that went up in flames, you saw there's 3 white girls that worked there that burned it up. And also in Minnesota, you saw a white supremacist, they caught him in the end, was the one who started a lot of the looting. Like he broke the windows to make that happen. And so I think those infiltrations are dangerous. And I think it's important for folks that care about Black lives and Black Lives Matter and this movement towards more racial justice to kind of disaggregate. And we don't need to defend, like someone committed arson, find the arsonists, like find them, somebody, we don't need to defend that in order to defend the movement for Black lives.
If you look at it, like the majority of these protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, the majority of them are peaceful. And then, you do have a lot of the looting and the violence actually takes place after, right?
Or it takes place in a different part of that
community. A different part, yeah. And then what you typically tend to see in the mainstream media is, the protests are covered, but they're gonna cover, right, the looting. They're gonna cover the violence. They're gonna cover the property destruction, and perhaps the looting or the property destruction had nothing to do with the protests. But if you're just watching it on a news story, you won't know that.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's kicked off a rage, on the right. Maybe not a rage, but just this anger on the right about what they're seeing depicted on the streets. And I think if we're not careful, like I like what you said about Antifa, how like they don't support. Like they're using some of these protests to sort of they're hitching onto some of these protests to promote some of their ideas. They might not even care per se about the protests, but it's just an opportunity, to hitch onto something that's getting some attention.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important for us to be savvy and to kind of see what's going on the left or the right. Because what we see on TV or what we see being covered in the news stories, stories often it's often more complex, right? It's
and
more
even
involved.
where they make Portland the epicenter of this, and Portland's like 5% Black. You look at the protests.
Yeah, I was in Portland
so it's like
a year and a half ago, right? And I think I counted maybe 5 Black people.
Portland is like if Alston was a city of 600,000 people.
Yeah.
That's like basically Alston, Cambridge. And so that's like to me, one of the most interesting parts of it is that it allows people, by using Portland, it kind of allows people to use it, a lot of people on the right wing to use it because it looks white. And so like they can impose a lot of their racial language, and it's like, well, it's white people, but then they juxtapose it with other protests in other places with a lot of people of color. And so it looks like it's all happening,
it's all the same, it's all mixed in,
and that they're correlated and connected, or that people are working together to do it. And so like that to me is the most problematic part, because I think all day I support the movement for Black lives, and I support Black Lives Matter, and I support marching for justice. And in the heat of the moment, if something happens and the police pop someone or brutalize someone right there in the moment, and that person's hurt, injured, and people start rioting there, I see that. I do have, and I do struggle with seeing rioting days after something happened, like far away from a protest with no, it almost feels very planned.
Mm.
And so I think it could be bad actors, right? Like someone wants to go break into something. Well, let's do it while a protest is going on because all the police are over there. That's a problem with policing too. Why
Mm.
are all the police there at the protest? Do you need that many? Like, obviously, if any criminal is going to know, they need to go to the other spot. Also, like, why aren't we thinking about, like, they found people that committed arson? A lot of them were white supremacists. Like, why aren't we rooting that out, thinking about that? And why is that, even when the Kenosha shooter was like in the news and people were talking about it, it was all very, you know, before, in the beginning, it was like people shot in Kenosha, unrest. For me, it felt like, you know, there were black people, like the way it was said, what it felt that way until you actually saw it, and the victims were white and the shooters white. It almost felt like whiteness was being protected there in the storyline.
Mm. Mm.
Like I said, I'm really uncomfortable with what I feel are like Civil War II practice games that are happening between, you know, kind of not just Antifa anarchists, and also like really, you know, white male rage on each side. That's,
Yeah.
and using us as the kind of the platform to do it. I don't like that, and
Yeah.
I don't like it happening. Um, you know.
Interesting times. It's we're in uncharted territory in this country. Like, this moment feels very, very different. I think, I'm hopeful that because we've seen a lot worse in this country. I'm hopeful that we can get through this sort of period in time, and find a way to remain united. Because like one of the things I always say, particularly when it comes to civil war, you know, um, the folks who want civil war in this country, failing to think about our enemies abroad, right? Who would love for us to destroy each other, right?
And are working actively towards that. I
Yeah,
mean, to be
absolutely,
sure.
absolutely. And so, um, I'm saying, well, we as a country need to find a way to get united.
And
Um,
I'll be honest, I mean, not even to get political here, but that unification is impossible under Donald Trump. He is the president for the people that voted for him, and that's it. He is not, look at there's the whole entire West Coast is on fire, right? He is not the president for states or places that didn't vote for him. And he makes that clear. I mean, even his daughter said it in his in their convention. You know, he works for you, like you, his supporters. He doesn't consider places that didn't vote for him to be his people. When in reality, every president, I mean, New York didn't vote for George Bush the first or the second time. And he was there, 9/11. Not to say he's great or anything, but I'm just saying,
yeah,
as a president, people need to think, yeah, you're obviously going to want to do more to protect your like base and make sure this, that. But like when a natural disaster strikes or something strikes, like it's your job and role as president not to denigrate an opposition leader or a state governor that's a different party than yours, and that's not the role. It's to unify and try to pull us.
yeah. I mean, I think I spoke to Trump supporters. I'm not taking one side or another, but I spoke to folks who are they like Trump. And they will even admit that he's probably not the best president to unify to unify
Yeah, I think they
on that.
I mean, I
At
think for
least
them it's
say,
like, yo, I'm down or throw it all away and burn it all down at the end of the day.
yeah,
Because if you're gonna tell me election day, if Donald Trump wins, and especially if he wins after losing the popular vote, if he wins, I don't know what happens. I don't know what
I
happens.
think I personally think, regardless if he wins or not,
It's gonna be
um,
violent.
I am worried about something popping off in this country. And you know, I don't necessarily know that Biden is the unifying type either.
I mean,
But
he's really unifying. No, I mean, he's unifying from jump. You see him today. He's like talking to Mike Pence. He's unifying. He is very.
yeah,
That's his ideology. which I
Sure.
think in the primary made a lot of people crazy because they're like, yo, the Republicans are the enemy. Like, you want to step on them, but he's not like that. That's just not who he is.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think he's the only person that can do it. And I think it's perfect that he ended up being the person that came out of the primary. But yeah, I definitely Donald Trump. There's no way I can ever, after coronavirus, after Hurricane Maria, there's after George Floyd, there's just no way in any of those situations that I've ever felt that he cared any piece about me or people that look like me.
Yeah. So, I think, man, I just want to see people get out and vote. I don't want folks to
Yeah,
stay home.
yeah, same.
Get out and vote. Vote whatever your preference is, but get out and vote.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I think with that said, I think we had a riveting discussion. I
Yeah,
really
great,
enjoyed it.
great.
And for the viewers, again, if you like what you heard, I encourage you to like and share. The podcast, the YouTube video. I really appreciate you joining us today, Peter, and thank you for tuning in.
All right, thank you.
All right, man.
Appreciate it.